The bridge that knew it would collapse. In the summer of 2018, a bridge in Genoa, Italy, carried 43 people to their deaths. But here's what makes this different from every other engineering disaster you've heard about. The bridge didn't just fail, it announced its own death. For decades, engineers heard its warnings, inspectors documented its wounds, government officials read the reports, and everyone did just enough to quiet the noise, but never enough to stop what was coming. This isn't a story about a bridge that collapsed. This is a story about a society that chose not to listen. And if you think this is just about one bridge in one city, you're about to discover something far more disturbing about the infrastructure you drive on every single day. Before we descend into this darkness, consider subscribing, because system failure exists to expose the truths that most channels won't touch. The engineering failures that were never accidents, the disasters that were always preventable, the systems designed to protect us that instead buried the warnings. The Morandi Bridge stood over the Polcevera Valley like a concrete colossus, 140 meters high, 1,100 meters long, named after its designer, Riccardo Morandi, who pioneered a revolutionary concept in the 1960s. He built bridges using pre-stressed concrete cables inside steel sheaths, then filled those sheaths with mortar. It was supposed to be the future. Elegant, cost-effective, visionary. Morandi was a genius, they said. His bridge was a masterpiece of post-war Italian engineering. When it opened in 1967, it represented everything Italy wanted to be. Modern, ambitious, looking forward instead of backward. The bridge carried the A10 motorway across the valley, connecting the port of Genoa to France. Thousands of vehicles crossed it every day. It became part of the city's identity, part of its skyline, part of its circulatory system. But Riccardo Morandi knew something that few people understood. His brilliant design had a fatal flaw built into its DNA. Concrete is strong under compression. Steel is strong under tension. Put them together and you get reinforced concrete, the material that built the modern world. But steel has an enemy: water, salt, time. Together they create corrosion. And corrosion is a silent killer. It happens inside the concrete where you can't see it, eating away at the structural integrity, weakening the very bones of the bridge. Morandi knew this. He wrote papers about it. He warned that his bridges needed constant, vigilant monitoring. The cables had to be inspected. The concrete had to be maintained. Any sign of deterioration had to be addressed immediately. He wasn't just suggesting best practices. He was issuing a prophecy. Take care of these structures, or they will kill people. In 1979, just 12 years after the bridge opened, something happened that should have been a wake-up call. A Morandi-designed bridge in Venezuela collapsed, the Maracaibo crossing. It failed because water had seeped into the cable stays, corroding the steel inside. Sound familiar? It should, because the Morandi Bridge in Genoa used the exact same design, the same materials, the same vulnerabilities. Engineers in Italy took notice. Studies were commissioned, reports were written. The documents from this period make for chilling reading because they're not vague. They don't dance around the problem. They state clearly and directly that the Morandi Bridge is at risk, that regular maintenance isn't enough, that the structure needs comprehensive monitoring and likely significant reinforcement. And then those reports were filed away. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, inspectors documented growing problems: cracks in the concrete, rust stains indicating corrosion inside the structural members, degradation of the cable stays. Each inspection generated a new report. Each report recommended interventions. Some minor repairs were completed, patches, cosmetic fixes, the equivalent of putting a Band-Aid on a fracture. Here's what you need to understand about infrastructure maintenance. There's a concept called deferred maintenance. It sounds technical, but it's simple. When something needs to be fixed and you don't fix it, you haven't made the problem go away. You've just pushed it into the future, and in the future, it's worse. and more expensive and more dangerous. Italy, like many developed nations, was playing a game of financial chicken with its infrastructure. The Morandi Bridge needed serious investment, millions of euros, possibly tens of millions. That kind of money requires political will. It requires convincing the public that spending huge sums on a bridge that seems to work fine is necessary. It requires admitting that previous maintenance wasn't adequate. So instead, they kicked the can down the road year after year, decade after decade. In 2009, Antonio Brencic, a professor of engineering at the University of Genoa, began sounding the alarm publicly. He didn't mince words. He called the Morandi Bridge a failure of engineering. He stated that Morandi's cable-stayed concrete design was fundamentally flawed, that the entire structure was vulnerable, that it needed to be either completely overhauled or demolished and replaced. People didn't want to hear it. The bridge was a landmark. Replacing it would cost a fortune and cause massive traffic disruptions. Brencic was dismissed as alarmist, too dramatic, too pessimistic, but Brencic kept talking. In 2016, he published a paper explicitly warning about the Morandi Bridge. He detailed the structural vulnerabilities. He explained how corrosion was likely compromising the integrity of the cable stays. He called for immediate action. By this point, the bridge was 49 years old, nearly 5 decades of weather, of salt air from the nearby Mediterranean, of vibrations from constant traffic, of deferred maintenance, of warnings ignored. The managing company, Autostrade per l'Italia, hired consultants. More studies were commissioned. A plan for reinforcement was developed. It would cost 20 million euros and take years to complete. The work was scheduled to begin, but not immediately. There were permits to obtain, contracts to negotiate, budgets to approve. Time. They thought they had time. In early 2018, new cracks were discovered in one of the bridge's support columns. Pier 9, the column supporting the cable, stays on the western side of the structure. Reports were filed, monitoring was increased. Engineers debated whether the cracks were superficial or indicative of deeper structural problems. They were still debating on August 14, 2018. It was a Tuesday morning, summer vacation season. The A10 motorway was busy as always, families heading to the coast, trucks transporting goods, commuters, ordinary people going about their lives, trusting that the infrastructure beneath them was sound. At 11:36 a.m. during a violent thunderstorm, Pier 9 failed. The western cable-stayed section of the bridge collapsed in seconds. 210 meters of roadway fell 45 meters into the valley below. Cars, trucks, and people plunged into the abyss. Some vehicles were crushed by falling concrete. Others fell to the ground or onto the rooftops of buildings below. 43 people died, men, women, children. Families were erased. Lives were ended in the time it takes to draw a breath. Rescue workers arrived to find an apocalyptic scene: twisted metal, pulverized concrete, vehicles compressed to a fraction of their original size, the sound of car alarms and screams, the smell of dust and fuel, rain still falling on the wreckage. The world watched in horror. How could this happen? How could a major bridge in a wealthy European nation simply collapse in the middle of the day? But the people who had been paying attention weren't asking how. They were asking why. Why had nothing been done? Why had the warnings been ignored? Why had the reports gathered dust while the bridge gathered cracks? In the aftermath, investigators descended on the wreckage. What they found confirmed the worst fears. The cable stays had been severely corroded. In some areas, up to 90% of the steel cross-section had been eaten away. 90%. The structural members were hollow shells. The bridge had been holding itself up through sheer stubbornness and luck, and on August 14th, both ran out. The cables inside the concrete should have been protected by the mortar filling the steel sheaths, but water had infiltrated, salt had accelerated the corrosion, and the inspection regime hadn't caught the extent of the damage, or if it had, the information hadn't translated into action fast enough. Documents emerged showing that engineers had been worried for years, emails, memos, meeting minutes, all painting a picture of growing concern and bureaucratic paralysis. Money was allocated but not spent. Reinforcement was planned but not executed. Warnings were heard but not heeded. Ricardo Morandi himself had died in 1989, but his warnings had outlived him, and they had been proven correct in the most tragic way possible. The political fallout was immediate and fierce. The Italian government revoked autostrade per l'Italia's concession to manage the motorway. Criminal investigations were launched. Engineers, managers, and government officials faced charges ranging from manslaughter to criminal negligence. The question wasn't just who was responsible, it was how the system could fail so completely. Because here's the thing about the Morandi Bridge collapse. This wasn't a bolt of lightning. This wasn't an earthquake or a freak accident. This was a slow-motion disaster that unfolded over decades. Every inspection that found problems, every report that recommended action, every warning that was ignored, each one was a moment when the trajectory could have changed. When those 43 lives could have been saved, the bridge was demolished in 2019, destroyed with carefully controlled explosions. Thousands watched as the remaining structure came down in seconds. It felt symbolic, an ending, but the questions remained. A new bridge was built in record time. Designed by renowned architect Renzo Piano, a Genoa native, it opened in 2020, just 2 years after the collapse. Sleek, modern, a tribute to the victims, but also a reminder, a permanent scar on the city's landscape. So what does this mean for you? Why should you care about a bridge collapse in Italy? Because the Morandi Bridge is not unique. The problems that killed 43 people are not isolated to one structure in one city. Right now, all over the world, there are bridges with warnings, infrastructure with documented problems, engineers issuing reports that get filed away, maintenance that gets deferred because fixing things that aren't yet broken is never a political priority. In the United States, the American Society of Civil Engineers gives the nation's infrastructure a C- grade. Thousands of bridges are classified as structurally deficient. They're not about to collapse tomorrow, but they need work. And that work keeps getting pushed into the future. In the UK, in Germany, in France, in Japan, aging infrastructure built in the post-war boom is reaching the end of its design life. And the question isn't whether it will fail, it's when, and whether we'll have done enough to prevent catastrophe. The Morandi Bridge teaches us something crucial about system failures. They rarely happen all at once. They happen slowly through 1,000 small decisions, through ignored warnings and deferred maintenance, through bureaucratic inertia and financial short-sightedness, through the very human tendency to assume that if something has worked fine until now, it will keep working until it doesn't. The bridge knew it would collapse. It told us. Through cracks and corrosion and documented deterioration, through the failure of its sister bridge in Venezuela, through the explicit warnings of its own designer. The information was there, the knowledge was available. What was missing wasn't information, it was action, and that's the most terrifying part, because information doesn't save lives, action does. And the gap between knowing something needs to be done and actually doing it can be measured in lives lost. 43 people woke up on August 14th, 2018, and went about their day. None of them knew they were about to cross a bridge that was ready to collapse. None of them knew that decades of warnings had been ignored. None of them knew that the concrete and steel beneath them was a hollow shell, corroded from within. They trusted the system. They trusted that someone was checking, that someone was maintaining, that someone was keeping them safe. That trust was betrayed. The next time you cross a bridge, think about what holds it up. Not just the concrete and steel, but the inspections, the maintenance, the political will to spend money on unsexy infrastructure. The engineers who write reports that no one reads. The gap between knowing and doing. And remember the Morandi Bridge. Remember that it announced its own death for decades. Remember that the warnings were there. Remember that someone, somewhere, made the decision that fixing it could wait. Remember the 43. If this story has made you see infrastructure differently, if you understand now that engineering failures are rarely just engineering failures, then subscribe to System Failure, because every week we explore the disasters that were always preventable. The systems that failed not through bad luck, but through bad choices. The dark side of human ambition and the price we pay when warnings are ignored. Hit that subscribe button, because the next bridge that knows it will collapse might be one you're about to cross. And you deserve to know the truth about the ground beneath your feet. The Morandi Bridge is gone now, but the lesson remains. The system that allowed it to fail is still very much intact.